Okay, I tried to do a stream earlier. I'm going to watch the comments. Let me know if this mic still sounds awful. Let me see if this helps. Okay. My mic stand broke. So if someone is out there, just tell me if it sounds bad. I'm going to try this again. Okay. I'm going to talk about Daniel because I'm excited about it. I'm thinking about it. I'm just waiting for someone to either, honestly, even to engage with this, or tell me it doesn't make sense, or you don't get it. But no one has, and I don't know. I'm open to being corrected, but I believe it falsifies many views if we take the text seriously. So I want to start by doing what I did in the last stream, which did not record well. Something was scrambled with it and the mic was weird. So let me first say, why is Daniel 8 not Antiochus Epiphanes? If we take the Bible as prophecy as being accurate and that we don't say somebody's a fulfillment of it if the criteria isn't met. Now, most futurists dig in when I point out that they make Jesus not fulfill the prophecy by putting his death outside of the 70 weeks. I may demonstrate that again, because I'll continue to say the truth until people will either give an argument that is faithful to Scripture, that's plausible, then I'll leave them. I won't keep harping on it. Because if your view makes Jesus not fulfill the prophecy, you should certainly discard it. And if your entire theology is based on it, I know it's probably hard to do, but you got to let it go. I'm accused often of just believing what I was taught, like people know it's wrong. But then I offer my own arguments from my own study that I didn't receive from what I was taught by looking at the text open-mindedly, listening to other people. How many of these people have actually studied the Adventist view? They haven't. They're projecting onto me what they're doing. And we all struggle with trying to think outside the box, but that's been my goal by engaging with different denominational perspectives. Almost nobody even knows what the Adventist view is very well. And so some do. But anyways, so let me start by explaining why Daniel 8 can't be Antiochus Epiphanes. Essentially, all commentators of all views have recognized at least parts, if not, just say it this way, the figure of Daniel 11 is the same person as the figure in Daniel 8. Okay? Oh, shoot, I closed it. Now I got to find it again. Let's see. It's probably this one. Nope. That one? Nope. Shoot. Give me a second. That's not it. Weird. I've got them all open. I can't find it. Okay, here it is. Okay. So this will be an overview of interpretation in Christian history. So in Daniel 8, you have the abomination of desolation. In the King James, it's rendered a little differently. Let's see if I can open that too. Yeah, there we go. Okay. It's in Daniel 8, verse 13. How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation? I believe it's most commentators at least see this as the same. I'm not sure if it's the exact same phrase or not. I don't want to misspeak, but the transgression of the desolation, because most people will, in the various interpretations, understand that to be, because that's talking about the temple being desecrated, and that's what the Antichrist will do if you believe in a future Antichrist or not. So the daily sacrifice in the temple in Daniel 8, we know that Jesus speaks of a future transgression of desolation in Matthew 24. Some people think that was just in 70 AD. And so naturally, if you study what the different commentators say of the different views, like the preterists, they want to tie Jesus' words in Matthew 24 with 70 AD, and that's it. But then they end up wanting to tie 7 and 8 relates desolation to the same thing, right? The time of the end in Daniel 8. The problem is the desolation that the figure in Daniel 8, if it's Antiochus, that occurred before Jesus was born. So if Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 are the same figure, and that figure in Daniel 8's abomination was before Jesus was born, how do you tie Daniel 9 to that? So it gets really funky. And at the end, I'll share with why Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 have to be the same figure, which everyone pretty much agrees on. But there's something at the end of Daniel 11 that makes that impossible. So let me start by giving some historical overview of when different views, and by whom these views came about. According to the preterist school of interpretation, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the 8th ruler of the Seleucid line of kings from 175 to 164 BC, is represented by the little horns of Daniel 7 and 8. The way they do this is by making the Medes and the Persians two separate kingdoms, so that the 4th kingdom is Greece there in 7, I believe, most preterists. That way the 4th kingdom, setting it up for Daniel 8, is Greece. And then, so it's Antiochus in 7 and 8, because they see that the characteristics of the little horn of Daniel 7 very much overlaps with the little horn of Daniel 8. Just like the figure in Daniel 11 has characteristics drawn out of what's described in Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 as well. So the three chapters and the figures, the little horn in 7 and 8, characterize the figure in Daniel 11. He has the features of both, in other words. It's apocalyptic literature and it's cryptic, but there's overlap between this figure. It's the figure opposing God that's developing up out of these historical kingdoms. And so people, bend the interpretation to fit that. So in other words, a preterist will agree with the futurist and say, and some historicists, that it's Antiochus. But the way they make that work, they turn the text into slop, absolute slop, or literally falsify it. But okay, so and the preterist believes that this the little horns in 7 and 8 are also concluded in 9:24 through 27 of Daniel, the famous he of Daniel 9:27. He also occupies most of chapter 11. Futurist expositors likewise see Antiochus in chapters 8 and 11. On the other end of the spectrum, the historicist school of interpretation, now represented mainly by Seventh-day Adventist writers, sees the king as occupying only a minimal role in these prophecies. The present author who wrote this restricts direct reference to 11, 15, and 16. In the following sections, the author traces the historical roots of this interpretation, which is so widely accepted today, Antiochus. The era surveyed extends from the mid-2nd century BC to the beginning of the 5th century AD. That's the spread of my view, in other words. Or wait, no, never mind. Scratch that. In this process, the author begins by reviewing 10 Jewish sources. The earliest is the Old Greek version of the Septuagint, which appears to have been corrupted in Daniel 9 to make the passage harmonize with the Antiochus fulfillment. Other known Jewish interpretations of Daniel 9 make no reference to the king, but bring the 70 weeks down into Roman times. In other words, a futurist or certain historicist views. The author of First Maccabees also appears to have correlated the desecration of the temple by Antiochus with Daniel 8. See First Maccabees 1, verse 54. But it is Josephus, after Jesus' crucifixion to about 100 AD is when he lived and wrote, who is the only known source from that period to make a direct identification of the little horn in Daniel 8 with Antiochus Epiphanes. So he flat out says the figure in Daniel 8 was Antiochus Epiphanes, Josephus. Even so, he curiously substitutes 1,296 days for the 2,300 days given in the text, verse 8:14, the 2,300 evenings and mornings. which makes it seem like he's cutting it into two, but nobody knows for sure because it's a weird amount. It's probably a strange rendering. Evidently, this was a conscious effort on his part to bring the prophecy into a closer correlation with the actual 3-year suspension of the temple rites, which is what's in Maccabees, right? So he probably chose those amount of days because he knew how many days it was actual. I'm trying to think the math on that. Who knows? But it seems like he's just saying it's 1296 because that's his rendering of the period in Maccabees where you would say the desolation occurred in literal days. No Christian writer on the prophecies prior to Hippolytus, AD 236, let's see. Nobody before Hippolytus in 236 AD has been found who identifies Antiochus with any prophecy in Daniel. 7 sources are reviewed. Irenaeus and Origen both identified the little horn of chapter 8 with a future Antichrist. And of course, future for them could fall into futurism or historicism as because they were prior to the period. Most historicists would say the little horn came out of Rome in the way most people would understand that. It hadn't come yet, whether it be the historic interpretation Rome hadn't fully developed into the civil power as the church yet. So it could be in sync with either of you when they were writing, if I recall. Hippolytus, who was a student of Irenaeus, who later served as a bishop in the vicinity of Rome during the early 3rd century, apparently has become a kind of watershed for prophetic interpretation. Were he living today, he could easily relate to 3 of the major schools of prophetic interpretation, meaning historicism, preterism, futurism. He could easily relate to, he was a historicist in his interpretation of Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. On the other hand, he was a futurist in his interpretation of Daniel 9, being the first known expositor to separate the 70th week from the preceding 69 and place its fulfillment at the end of the age, which is weird because Irenaeus apparently didn't do that, his teacher. So in other words, I would say this, because some of the prophecies, if you're a historicist anyway, or a futurist actually, obviously this would be the case with the futurist too, but depending on what you mean by futurist, if you just mean things that haven't happened yet and they're going to happen in the future as just a general term, but if you mean a specific school of interpretation today, a futurist would be something more specific. But in other words, they believed these things weren't fulfilled yet. They weren't preterists, in other words, you could say. And at that time, a futurist is a preterist, or a historicist is a futurist at that time because the things that occurred historically hadn't occurred yet because it was early in the Christian era. But in his Hippolytus now, in his interpretation of Daniel 8 and 11, he was a preterist. He identified the little horn of chapter 8 and various portions of chapter 11 in a haphazard manner with Antiochus. It may be determined by matching his comments with First Maccabees that he used Maccabees, as his key to interpret Daniel 8, like Josephus. He is the first Christian so this is a little factor that you might want to remember, whatever your position is. Hippolytus, a student of Irenaeus who lived in the mid-200s AD, Hippolytus, a student of Irenaeus, was the first Christian commentator to identify the little horn in chapter 8 with Antiochus Epiphanes, Hippolytus. And of course, also Josephus did as well. And they both seem to use Maccabees, I guess, as their key to that, to come to that conclusion. So let's see, what's my argument? I was going to say, if you're a preterist, so here's my comments about being a preterist or a futurist. I've argued that you certainly, if you're going to stick to your guns on futurism, which I don't think you should, but if you do, I recommend what I've heard Gleason Archer, who gives word to my interpretation, which is historically the Protestant view, that Jesus died in the 70th week. He brought the sacrifices to an end, and they're not coming back because he is the one sacrifice for all sin. But if you insist on robbing Jesus of the one verse that puts his death exactly in the 70th week and fulfills prophecy according to Daniel 9:27, if you insist on robbing that from Jesus and placing his death outside of the time period allotted to make reconciliation for iniquity or atonement for iniquity, if you just must make it so he fails the prophecy and then say that's about a future Antichrist, if you're going to do that, I recommend not putting Jesus outside of the prophecy so he fails it, making the first part of that be the first half of the week, and then say the second half of the week, 70th week, is the future, because that's all you really need anyways, right? Because the 1260, according to you, are literal days, which is only 3.5 years. So you could actually just take the second half of the week and put it in the future, keep Jesus in the timeline, go with the timeline that works, so the prophecy is actually fulfilled properly. Then at least you're not robbing Christ of being the Messiah, according to the text. Gleason Archer suggests that. That would at least keep you from making a heretical claim that you don't even recognize. But here's the issue though there, why I don't recommend it altogether. But if you insist, be less sloppy and make Jesus fulfill the prophecy so he's actually the Messiah as it is written, have you not read? But the reason I don't recommend that either is because now you have a problem. The years from the decree until Jesus' arrival in 27 AD do not have 360 days in them. But yet your view says the days in the prophecies are literal days. But the text actually only has you counting years, because Daniel's 70 weeks are years, or the sevens if you must, but it really is weeks. It's the same word as weeks, and it's translated as weeks in the King James, chapter 10, and other places. So the same construction is said to be weeks elsewhere. So they are weeks, and weeks have 7 days in them. Each day is a year. Okay, they're not heptads. If they're heptads, then every place that talks about 7 days of a week full of 7 days is also a heptad. So, but either way, each unit is a year. The way the Jews' calendar work, thinking you have to convert it to 360-day years and then converting it to a true year, because the Jews' calendar pretty much stays on track, although with fluctuations, but it stays on years to keep the seasons in line. If you are taking 360 and then turning them into and dividing it by or multiplying it by 360 and then dividing it by a year and then multiplying it back to true years, why are you doing that? It doesn't tell you to do that. You count years, and their years were not 360 days and then that's a year and then another. No, there's only one festival per year, and the years are not 360 days long. They're 353 days long, or 354, depending on if they add an extra day to the 8th month, which they would do, and then the next month they may take away a day in order to make sure that those festivals do not fall. The spring festivals don't fall on the same day as the weekly Sabbath. The other ones can earlier in the year, but they could adjust by a day for 2 months to keep that, to make sure that doesn't happen, because every so often it would come up where that would happen. So they'd have to remove a day. And then they'd add a 13th month, which always had 30 days in it, 7 out of every 19 years, which is a little more than every third year. Those years have 383 days or 384, one more or one less, okay? Depending on that, if that adjustment had to be made. So what does that mean? It means that the first 69 weeks of years did not have 360 days in each year. This was a real prophecy for the real Jews, and we know what their calendar is. Therefore, if you try to make the 1260 mentioned in Revelation and Daniel be part of the 70 weeks, well, they didn't render the weeks, or they didn't render the years with 360 days in them. And you're saying either the whole 70th week or half of it is represented by the 1260. Here's the problem. 3.5 years never has that many days in it. Never, ever. And so how can you say the 70th week is the 1260 when we know all the weeks in literal time didn't have that amount of days in it, no matter where you start your count? Anywhere in that 483 years, is there any stretch, no matter what day you start on, with 1260 days in a 3.5 year period? So the reason that's a problem is because you say, if they're actual days in the text to be taken literally, you're saying those years are broken up by the days, the 3.5 year period. Your view says they're literal, but a literal year doesn't have that increment of days in it, and it never does. You're the one saying it's to be interpreted literally. So you need to either say it's not literal, it's just loose. Daniel didn't know that his calendar really didn't work that way, even though we know he knew how to render the calendar. And at that time of Daniel, we can correlate biblical history. So your insistence that they're literal days is falsified by its own claim, because we know the first sets of weeks that no one was rendering years with 360 days in them, at least not after the flood anyways, but that's speculation. We know this. We have their writings. It's actually in the Bible. They had to adjust to keep Passover in the spring. So did Daniel know that? Well, he was reading Jeremiah. Did Daniel know that the festivals were not once every 360 days? Did he know that they were keeping time to keep Passover in spring every year so it didn't drift like the Muslim calendar does, like the Islamic calendar, which is a strictly lunar calendar, not a lunisolar? Did Daniel not know that when he wrote those days, which were a lunar reckoning? Did he not know a real year in time? Did he not know that the 70 weeks of years weren't years? Did he know they weren't years? Or did he think he could build a temple that fast? No, when Daniel wrote it, he would have known that those aren't literal time periods, because he knows a year in the Jewish calendar doesn't have that amount of days in it. So when he was writing days, he would know that they can't be literal. He would know that the 70 weeks were years, because no one can build a temple that fast anyway, even if you want to consider that. But everybody agrees those are years. So in other words, stop believing a false thing. It's that easy. Start over.